So in verse 10 onwards, Paul goes on to take on the topic of contentment. And I believe this is an important topic that we as Christians need to get a hold of. So if you look at verse 12, somewhere downwards, let me begin with that. He has said, I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation. So this is something that he has learned over time. So if you actually look at Paul's life, it has been since the day of Damascus, it has been a very difficult life for him. There have been times that he has been up, and there have been times where he has been down. And this he actually describes from verse 10 right up to verse 12, where he talks about this kind of a roller coaster life that he has actually had. And in that he says how he knows what it's like to live very humbly. He has learned how it is to be in prosperity, and then again he talks about going hungry, and then he has talked about being filled, and then again he talks about suffering in need, and then he also talks about having abundance. And what Paul says is in all this, he has learned how to be content. How he has learned to be, in other words, for contentment is obviously satisfied. So, whether in need or whether in plenty, being satisfied. Now, I believe this is actually a statement that Paul is making. Being content is something that I believe that we need to learn. We need to learn to live according to our means. In fact, this is something that Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 6. Paul tells Timothy, contentment with godliness is great gain. And this is something that I believe that we need to learn. We need to live by. And this is not something that God gives us. But I'll tell you one thing. At the end of the scripture, in verse 13, and we will come to that, it says, I can do all things, all this through him who gives me strength. So, contentment, in other words, is something that we need to do, but God gives us the strength to actually do it, right? Now, if you actually take the subject of contentment, if you look at the world today, the world teaches you what? You need to acquire stuff. You must not be happy where you are, but you need to keep moving. Now, whilst I agree with some of those things, when it comes to things like possessions and when it comes to things like lifestyle, when it comes to things like, living life, I believe there are limits. We need to be content with what we can have. Now, I'll give you a good example. I have quite a few people working under me. And most of these people, they are paid a salary, and some of them are paid fairly good salaries, but their lifestyle is not according to what their salary gives them. They need to live like the Joneses. If one guy gets an iPhone, the next guy, even though he can't afford it, needs to take a loan and buy an iPhone. This is not contentment. This is basically living not according to their means, but living according to their greeds. And I believe Paul is addressing this subject of contentment here. And he's saying we need to, whether we have or whether we don't have, we need to be content. Then Paul comes to verse 13 where he can says, I can do this through Christ who gives me strength. Now I believe verse 13 is one of the most misinterpreted scriptures in the Bible. We use this verse in all kinds of contexts, taking it totally out of context. And most of the time, we use it like, I can do everything. I'm like Iron Man or I'm like Superman or whatever, and I can do all things that through Christ that gives me strength. And in fact, it says, people actually go on to preach and say, that taking this totally out of context. But we need to understand the context in which Paul is using this. He's talking about his up and down lifestyle, and then he talks about contentment, and then he says, to be content, he can do all these through who? And it says, through him. Who is him? Christ, that gives me strength. Friends, I believe God, based on Paul's teaching here, Christ expects us to be content. right? Being happy with what we have, right? Being happy with some of the possessions that we have. The moment you actually strive to acquire more, right? What are you doing? You're actually living according to the way the world wants you to live. And remember earlier on, we discussed the importance of being Christ like and being like Christ. So, this is basically what Paul is talking about here.